Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Yeah, welcome to the Deep Dive.
The show where we take your curiosity and a collection of sources and really try to extract those key insights.
So good stuff.
The good stuff.
Yeah.
And also some of those surprising facts that you need.
Yeah.
Designed specifically for you, the learner. We know you've got wide range of interests.
We do.
And our goal here is to give you that knowledge quickly but thoroughly without overwhelming you with detail.
Quickly but thoroughly, that's the name of the game. So today, we're diving deep into the fascinating and often really unexpected challenges of translation. You shared with us excerpts from Song Ying Tong's The Translator is a Traitor.
Ooh, the translator is a traitor. I like it.
Yeah. And it's really fascinating because this book draws on the author's 30 years, 3 decades of personal experience and reflections in this field.
30 years, that's a long time.
Yeah.
So much insight to pull from.
So much to say. So our mission is to really uncover those hidden complexities involved in taking a text from one language and bringing it into another.
Exactly. We're going to explore that very intriguing relationship between the translator and the original author.
Yeah.
It's not always what you might expect.
Sometimes adversarial, sometimes very collaborative.
Yeah. We'll look at that delicate art of balancing, staying faithful, that faithfulness to the original.
Right.
But then also the need for that creativity.
Yeah.
Right? To make it work in a new language.
Yeah, make it sing in that new language.
And then there are the subtle but oh so important nuances within language itself.
Yeah.
From common high-frequency words that we don't even think about.
Yeah.
To those real brain teasers.
Yeah.
Like place names, personal names.
Personal names.
Onomatopoeia.
Onomatopoeia.
The words that mimic sounds.
Yes, those words are fun.
We'll also touch on some of the common mistakes that can happen in translation.
Yeah.
And the sometimes very surprising feelings that a translator can develop.
Yeah.
For the books that they've spent so much time with.
Yeah.
So, okay. Let's unpack this.
All right, let's dive in. I think it's really interesting to start with the translator-author relationship. And in the introduction, I was really fascinated by the author's story of failing the Fujian Catholic University Graduate Institute of Translation entrance exam.
Ooh, wow.
Yeah.
Entrance exam. So, clearly a pivotal point.
A pivotal point. What was interesting is that the author reflects on that and says that this actually led to a very crucial realization.
Yeah.
That a good translator prioritizes the message over writing in a flamboyant or stylistic way.
Right. It's really, I think a lot of people think of translators as almost these robotic machines.
Yeah.
Just, swapping out words.
Word swap.
Word swap, right.
Yeah.
And you can get very caught up in the beauty of language.
Yeah.
But it's really about conveying that message.
Yeah, you're serving the text. You're serving the author.
Yeah.
And the author has a message, and that's what you have to make come through.
And this kind of connects to a broader point that the author brings up about the different approaches often seen between Western and Eastern translators.
Right. So this is interesting because the author, they're working from English into Chinese. And oftentimes what they see working in that direction is translators often prioritize accuracy and fidelity to the original text.
Yeah.
Now, Western translators, particularly in literary translation, they tend to place a higher value on this artistic expression and achieving that same kind of artistic impact.
That's interesting, yeah.
So, this immediately brings to mind that central idea of translation as betrayal, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So we have these two priorities.
Right.
Right. Artistic impact versus literal accuracy. And this reveals a core tension at the heart of translation theory.
Yes, and the author grapples with this internal conflict. It's that constant push and pull between wanting to stay close to the original words, but also wanting to create a Chinese text that feels natural.
Yeah.
Right, in its own right, powerful in its own right.
Yeah.
And they even give a specific example, translating no regret as, and you're gonna have to help me with the pronunciation on this, wu yuan wu hui.
Wu yuan wu hui.
Okay. Which, while capturing that sentiment, adds that extra layer of without repentance, which isn't explicitly stated in the English.
Right.
So there's that temptation, I guess,
Yeah.
to want to add a little something.
Yeah, give it a little oomph, a little extra flavor.
A little oomph, yeah.
Yeah.
For better expression in Chinese.
Yeah, and I think this tension really underscores the importance of that direct communication with the author, which becomes a recurring theme throughout the book. And the author shares several really compelling stories about this.
Oh, yeah. And one of the most eye-opening is that experience with Jonathan Franzen. He actually wondered why there had been no contact at all during the translation of the corrections.
Wow.
Yeah, it really shows how different the expectations can be.
Yeah, different expectations. And I think maybe for Frenson, he probably expected or even really valued that direct engagement with the translator. And then you have the interesting debate around potentially renaming Howard to Scott in the Chinese translation of less, because Scott sounds kind of like higher in English. So, I mean, this would introduce a layer of humor that wouldn't be there in the English. And it's interesting because the author initially decides against the change, but later, reflecting on Andrew Sean Greer's work and his emphasis on humor, actually regrets not making that change.
Yeah.
And it really shows how even seemingly small decisions
Right.
can have these unexpected layers of meaning.
I think this is a great example of how much thought goes into translation.
Yeah.
You really have to think about those layers. And then there's that almost detective work.
Yeah.
Tracking down that journey to the West quote.
Yeah.
That's in Tess Gerritsen's novel, The Silent Girl.
Yeah, right.
The author's dedication to actually finding that original source, even though the author had slightly altered it, really shows the importance of accuracy and thoroughness for so many translators.
It's fascinating to see this range of author engagement, right? The author shares these positive experiences with writers like Susan Orlean, Jeffrey Deaver, Jennifer Egan, Richard Phillips, and Amy Waldman, all of whom were incredibly helpful and really appreciated the translator's questions and insights.
Yeah, it shows that sometimes translation can really be a true collaboration.
Yeah.
But of course, you also have the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Authors who are less responsive, like the writer of that new business book.
Right.
Or even Philip Roth, who had his own very specific and separate review process. It really just highlights how not all authors approach translation the same way.
Right. Different strokes for different folks.
But the author's continued commitment to reaching out to living authors, despite all these challenges, I think is really admirable.
Oh, absolutely. Really is. And I think this leads us to another really interesting point. This analogy of the translator as a bug catcher.
Bug catcher.
Yeah.
So they're not just fixing grammar.
Right. No, they're not just linguistic go-betweens. They're actually identifying and even correcting sometimes errors and inconsistencies.
Okay, now give me some examples.
Okay, so there's the discrepancy between a mule and a donkey in the Sisters Brothers. And of course, the author, he readily acknowledged his own mistake.
Okay.
And then there's that pronoun issue and that surprise of beef.
Beef.
In what was supposed to be vegetable soup.
Oh, wow.
In the mountain between us.
That's a pretty significant error.
It is, yeah. And these aren't just minor oversights. Like, for example, the 2 centuries versus 2,000 years error.
Right.
In the keepsake, that really affects how we understand the historical context and the timeline of the story.
Yeah, big difference.
Big difference, yeah. Or that date discrepancy in The Orchid Thief and the news clipping.
Yeah.
That could potentially really undermine the factual basis of what is a nonfiction work.
That's true, yeah.
Right. And then, of course, there's the challenge of translating manuscripts that are still being revised.
Oh, my gosh. Yeah.
So the author talks about Find Me with its multiple versions, and then there's those Italian chapter titles. Those arrived really late in the game.
Ugh, that's tough.
So it really highlights that translation work can be very dynamic and sometimes chaotic.
It can be.
Yeah.
So chaotic.
But it's so interesting because the author talks about this analogy of the translator as a surrogate mother.
Right.
Identifying and correcting those issues before the birth of the translated book.
Yeah, that is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've looked at this kind of fascinating author-translator relationship.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to those nuances of language.
Right.
Starting with something that might seem pretty basic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
High-frequency words.
Right. So these are the common words, the ones we use all the time, but they can actually present really complex challenges for translators.
Oh, definitely. I mean, take the example of the word fuck in Sweet Bitter.
Yeah.
I mean, this word comes up so much.
It does, yeah.
And you have to consider, well, how often do you translate it in the same way?
Right. To make sure you're conveying that same level of impact.
Yeah, you want to capture the same kind of register.
Yeah, register, right.
Yeah.
And then you also have to think about it's used by a very specific character.
Right.
In a particular context.
And it's not just the dictionary definition, right? There's the connotation, the emotional weight.
Yeah.
And even the speaker's individual voice, right?
Yeah.
How do they say it?
Yes.
So, I mean, then you have the repetition of words like smile, suddenly, totally. These come up a lot in Find Me.
Right.
And the author points out that you really have to think about varying these translations to avoid that kind of repetition in Chinese.
Yeah.
But, of course, at the same time, you want to remain faithful to the author's stylistic choices.
Right.
So you've got accuracy and naturalness.
I think that's one of the hardest things.
It is. It is. It's a balancing act.
A balancing act.
Yeah. And, sometimes that repetition can even be a deliberate part of the author's style.
Yeah. Like D.H. Lawrence's use of the word mechanical. So you have to recognize that and resist smoothing it out too much.
Resist that urge.
Resist that urge, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that comes up, too, with the frequent use of course, in past imperfect.
Right.
These seemingly insignificant words
Yes.
can really add to that character's voice and the overall tone.
Yes, absolutely.
And the author, they also talk about English words that can be really redundant in Chinese, like success, but.
But, yeah.
And these are instances where the translator, they might choose to be more concise in the translation.
So you can leave out some of those extra.
Sometimes you can, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then there are also cases where you need to repeat, actually, to be accurate.
Right.
So you can reflect the structure and emphasis of that original text, like in the submission where they talk about the names, the buildings, the attack.
Yeah.
And then you have the N-word in Mark Twain. So there's that difficult choice between using Hindu black slave versus Hegi black devil. And this is really a question of ethics. How do you deal with that historical context, but also be sensitive to contemporary readers in this different context?
Yes, absolutely.
So there's so much sensitivity required in translation.
Yeah.
And, you see that, too, with phrases like by and variations in those 19th century novels. It's about finding that appropriate way to convey these older styles in modern Chinese.
Yeah.
It's like the translator is this bridge between different times, really.
Yeah.
And then you have Mark Twain's dialect and religious exclamations, which can also be very difficult. It's about understanding those nuances, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've looked at the fine details of individual words.
Yeah.
Now let's zoom out and look at those place names.
Okay.
And I think, a lot of times people might think, oh, this is pretty straightforward.
Yeah, you just look it up in the dictionary.
Right, look it up in the dictionary.
Yeah.
But it's so much more than that.
Yeah. Oh, it is, yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And, the example of the Adriano Celentano song really illustrates this disconnect between sound and meaning.
Yeah, so for our listeners who aren't familiar, this song is basically gibberish.
Yeah.
It's made to kind of sound like English.
Like American English, yeah.
But it was a hit. It was a hit.
It was a hit.
So it shows that the sounds of language,
yeah,
they can really have an impact regardless of whether you understand the meaning.
Yeah, yeah. And there's also that anecdote about smells like teen spirit. People often don't understand what Kurt Cobain is saying, but it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
They still feel that connection, right?
Right. It's more than just the literal meaning. And then we have the Coca-Cola example.
Yeah, yeah. A very famous one.
And this is a classic illustration, right?
Yeah.
Where they really prioritized the sound and memorability
right
in Chinese rather than a literal translation.
Yeah.
And then the debate around translating snake fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So should it be based on its English sound or its literal meaning, like on dili shikwe?
Yeah.
So it highlights, again, that balancing act.
Yeah.
Between phonetic similarity, semantic accuracy, and then also those cultural associations.
Right, right.
So interesting. And, we also have these examples of translations that might sound pretty, I guess, or appealing.
Yeah.
But they can actually be quite misleading.
Yeah.
So like Fontainebleau.
Yeah.
So this is often translated as beautiful water spring, Li Shui Guan.
Li Shui Guan, yeah.
But that really doesn't capture the essence of this place.
Doesn't at all.
And Florence becomes emerald green. Fei Ling Kui,
right, yeah.
So poetic, but doesn't really give you a real sense of that city.
No, it doesn't, no.
So these types of translations, they sound nice.
They do. They sound pretty.
But they're not accurate.
Yeah, not accurate at all. And then you have Donau, which just gets translated as Danube River, Duo Now He. Right, yeah.
So you lose that original Germanic sound.
And you also lose some of the cultural context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the evolution of Portugal. So starting with Fulamji, then it became Bodia, now it's Futaya.
Yeah.
So that shows how these translations can change and evolve.
Yeah. And sometimes become more phonetically accurate, sometimes culturally adapted, sometimes just more widely accepted.
Yeah.
And then you have a great example, the widely accepted translation of Wuthering Heights.
Wuthering Heights.
As Pao Xiao Shan Zhuang.
Pao Xiao Shan Zhuang.
Which means Roaring Mountain Villa. So it really captures that atmospheric sound, weathering, and the geographical aspect of the original title.
So good. It sets a really high standard for translation.
Absolutely. And then you have those regional pronunciations.
Yeah.
Like in Oregon. So locals would say Oregon.
Oregon.
But elsewhere, it's Oregang.
Oregang.
Yeah.
So, even within a single language, there can be all these variations. And, I mean, it's important to consider that, especially if a story is set in that region and you're aiming for authenticity.
Absolutely. And then Obama. I mean, there are many different ways to translate his name. Or the decision to translate Åland, based on its Swedish pronunciation, Ilandau.
Right. So that really shows the importance of considering that source language's phonetics. Even something like the Cantonese translation of Portland Bolun.
Belunda.
That shows the influence of dialects.
Yeah.
So there are all these different factors. And then, of course, you have that Long Beach, Long Tao discrepancy and Junipero.
Junipero, yeah.
Which is hard to pronounce. And then those difficult English places. Those are real headaches.
Yeah. Gloucester.
Yeah, Gloucester, Worcester.
Leicester.
Wow. And they don't give you much of a clue.
Not at all.
How to pronounce them based on how they're spelled. And even San Pedro, how it's pronounced differently.
Yeah. Chompizu. Regionally, yeah. And then those common New York pronunciations, Houston is Hausidon, Amherst as Anmosite.
Yeah. Local knowledge is important.
Yeah.
Really is. And then the preference for Seoul over Hansong and Columbia over Columbia, that shows how politics and history can influence accepted translations.
So from the geography of language, let's talk about the individuals.
Okay.
Personal names. So this is just a straightforward transliteration process, right?
Maybe not entirely, no.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, the author shares this funny story about a radio station, and they were mispronouncing George Michael as George Michel.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
So, I mean, even simple names can trip people up.
It's true.
Right. And then you have the question of using established translations for famous names, right? So you have Paulo Coelho, right? Who's commonly known as Carrier, but in Portuguese would be Cusilvi.
Right.
So the question is, do you stick with what's familiar and accepted, or do you prioritize phonetic accuracy?
Yeah. And the author also talks about respecting that original language pronunciation, particularly with names like Anne Frank, where the Dutch and German pronunciations are so different from what we're used to in English.
Yeah. And then you have those untranslatable sounds, like the Dutch G in Van Gogh.
It's just so hard to replicate that.
It is, yeah.
So transliteration is basically taking the sounds and finding the corresponding sounds in another language's alphabet.
Right.
But sometimes there's not a corresponding sound.
Yeah. It can be a real puzzle.
So you have to be a detective, I guess.
Yeah, linguistic detective. Yeah.
And biblical names are also interesting because sometimes the translations are different depending on the context.
Right.
So, you might translate John as Johann in a religious context, but then you might translate it differently in a secular one.
Yeah, it all depends on the context. And then you have the overuse of certain Chinese characters, like fo for F.
Yeah.
And that can lead to these names sounding really similar. And those older transliteration conventions, like Sun for son, and those really localized names like Yunishan for Jonathan.
Right.
They show how those transliteration practices evolve over time. And while common names with established translations are pretty straightforward, the more unusual or complex names can be real pronunciation puzzles.
I mean, Jake Gyllenhaal's surname.
Oh, yeah.
How do you translate that?
That's a tough one. Yeah. And then there's that funny example of Ray LaMontagne being misnamed Montage.
Oh, great.
That shows how easily these names can be misheard and mistranslated.
And, the author also points out that sometimes you can actually use names to highlight different time periods.
Yeah.
So like that contrast between the more traditional Lei Ubo Day or Liao Pu Day for Leopold and the more modern Lai Nuo for Lionel.
Right.
And also sometimes those names can even indicate ethnicity like Friedman, Hoffman, Goldberg, Cohen, Zuckerman, often suggesting a Jewish background.
Yeah, and you have to be sensitive to that. And, Hemingway even uses those first and last names to denote relationships. Like in The Sun Also Rises, you have Robert Cohn versus Brett's fiancé Michael. Or sometimes he's just Mike.
Right. It's a very subtle narrative cue.
It is, yeah.
But it's important.
Yeah. And then, of course, there are those potential pitfalls when it comes to gender and transliteration.
Oh, right.
Like, Dana-Farber and James being used for Zhang Mu An Sha, which is actually a geographical feature.
Yeah, you have to be so careful.
Yeah. So all of this shows that translating personal names, it's so much more than just finding the equivalent sound.
Yeah, it's so much more nuanced.
Much more, yeah.
Okay, so we've navigated the tricky terrain of individual words, those personal names, place names. Let's talk about the sounds that words make. Onomatopoeia.
Onomatopoeia.
So that's a universal language, right?
Not quite as universal as you might think.
Okay. Explain.
So, take the term GG in Chinese literature.
GG, okay.
That can be used to describe so many different things, like the sounds of weaving, sighing, even birds and crickets.
Wow. That is broad.
It is really broad. And it shows how, compared to English, many Chinese onomatopoeic terms can be really general.
Yeah, that's interesting because English has a really rich and specific vocabulary.
Oh, yeah.
Just think about birds. Chirp, cheep, chitter, pip, trill, twitter, tweet, hoot, quack, honk, caw, cock-a-doodle-doo, hum, chickadee, chiff-chaff.
Yeah, wow.
And each of those conveys a distinct sound.
Absolutely.
So much specificity.
It's true. And then the author points out that you have those limitations with more general Chinese descriptions, right? And I think that's really interesting when you compare it to William Morton's Birdie and his creative onomatopoeia. He's using words like queep and creep.
Right, very specific sounds.
Yeah, and it's harder to replicate that in Chinese.
And then, of course, we have the variety of English words for dog sounds. Woof, yep, yep, ruff, arf, growl, bow, wow.
Versus wang, wang.
Right, wang, wang.
Yeah.
That really highlights the difference.
Yeah, and it's not just English and Chinese. The author also mentions dog sounds in other languages.
Yeah.
And then, we have this very specific ribbit.
Ribbit, yeah.
Which we use for frogs. And, in Chinese, it's more general, like wa sheng or wa ming.
Yeah. And the author even brings up that pun in Shrek 2. He croaked.
Right.
Yeah. So ribbit is so ingrained in American culture as that quintessential frog sound. But someone who's not familiar with that onomatopoeia might not get it at all.
No. And I think, American media, especially cartoons, they've really popularized ribbit globally.
Yeah, ribbit is everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, the author provides some examples of other sounds, like bees, wang wang, wang hoo hoo, rain ji li, thunder, hong long, knocking, dunk, dong, dong.
Yeah.
But, these can also have different variations.
Yeah.
And connotation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And cultural context.
Absolutely.
So this section really shows that onomatopoeia is another area where we can have those fascinating translation challenges.
Right.
Okay, so we've really delved into the details of language itself.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the translator's potential love-hate relationship with the books they work on.
Yeah, right. It's not always a purely enjoyable process.
Right.
So the author begins by mentioning well-known authors who really hate their own works.
Oh, like who?
So they give the example of Stephen King and his feelings about Dreamcatcher.
Okay, yeah.
And an earlier novella.
Okay.
And I think this sets up this idea that translators who spend maybe even more intense and focused time with the text might develop these complex and even negative feelings.
Right, but as the author points out, they often can't openly express those negative opinions.
Right. They might be afraid of those professional repercussions or negative feedback.
Yeah.
And the author shares that story about a translator who criticized the protagonist in the afterword.
Oof.
Yeah. That translator got a lot of criticism.
Yeah.
So there are these expectations on translators to present the work in a very positive light.
And I think that the author also touches on those practical realities.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Especially early in a translator's career, there's often limited choices available.
Yeah, so you take what you can get.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And you might not always love the project that lands on your desk.
Right. And the author's own early experiences translating that contemporary thriller and that business book, it really illustrates this point.
Yeah.
So, it's not always a dream project.
Yeah. But then, of course, you also have the other side of that immense joy that comes from translating a book that you love.
Yes, absolutely.
Like the author's experience with Cain and Abel.
Yeah, a book that he had wanted to read since his university days.
He was so excited.
Very much so. And then he talks about, the disappointment of not being able to translate some of his favorite books due to scheduling issues or just the fact that he wasn't the right fit for the project.
Right. And the author also wisely cautions about the danger of over-translating when you're really passionate about a book.
Yeah, you don't want to overshadow the author's voice.
Right. But then what's more common, I think, for translators is that feeling of admiration for the original coupled with that sometimes frustrating awareness of your own limitations.
Yeah, like you can't quite perfectly capture the brilliance in another language.
And the author says, books translated to death are literary masterpieces.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it really highlights that gap between the original and even the most skilled translation.
Absolutely.
And sometimes even positive feelings can turn negative due to external factors.
Yeah.
The author actually talks about experiencing illness during the translation process.
Yeah. And that can really, sour you on a particular book.
Right. I mean, that would make sense.
Yeah. And then you also have that challenge of authors who change their writing style.
Oh, yeah. That can be tough.
Yeah. And that can really lead to a fluctuating relationship with their body of work.
Yeah. It's so interesting to think about how all these things, they're all part of that process.
Yeah. And then sometimes you have that really surprising experience where you actually start to enjoy a book that you initially didn't like. Host